The autumn wind swept across the rolling hills of Cedar Falls, Montana, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter's approach. Emma Chen pressed her forehead against the cool window of the Greyhound bus, watching the familiar landscape unfold before her eyes, like pages from a book she'd tried so hard to forget. 8 years. 8 years since she'd left this place with nothing but a broken heart and shattered dreams. Now at 26, she was returning not as the triumphant journalist she'd once imagined herself becoming, but as a granddaughter coming home to watch the woman who raised her slowly fade away. The bus shuddered to a stop at the tiny station that barely qualified as more than a covered bench. Emma gathered her two worn suitcases and stepped into the crisp Montana air. Nothing had changed. The same weathered buildings lined Main Street. The same mountains stood sentinel in the distance, and the same oppressive feeling of being trapped settled over her shoulders like a familiar, unwelcome coat. Emma Chen. She turned to find Mrs. Patterson from the general store squinting at her through thick glasses, her gray hair still perfectly permed, despite the years that had passed. "My goodness, child, you look just like your grandmother did at your age. How is dear May? We've all been so worried." Emma forced a smile, the same practiced expression she'd perfected during countless freelance interviews when editors looked at her with barely concealed disappointment. "She's managing. Thank you for asking." The older woman's face softened with sympathy. "Such a shame about her diagnosis. Alzheimer's is a cruel thief, isn't it? Takes everything precious and leaves only shadows behind." The words hit Emma like a physical blow, but she kept her smile steady. She'd had 3 months to process the news since Dr. Williams had called her cramped studio apartment in Portland with the diagnosis. 3 months to wrestle with the guilt of staying away so long, of building a life hundreds of miles from the woman who'd raised her after her father abandoned them when Emma was 7. "I should get going," Emma said, hefting her suitcases. "Grandma May is expecting me." "Of course, dear. Oh, before I forget." Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice conspiratorially. "You might want to avoid the Morrison Ranch Road. Jake's been having some trouble with teenagers pranking his property. Apparently someone's been targeting him specifically." Emma's stomach tightened at the mention of that name. Jake Morrison. Even after 8 years, hearing it still felt like touching a live wire. "Teenagers, you say? Probably thinks it's funny to mess with the ranch since Jake's been struggling so much since his father passed. Some people have no respect for grief, I tell you." Emma nodded absently, her mind already elsewhere. Jake Morrison. The boy who'd once meant everything to her. The boy who'd destroyed her future with a single careless moment of selfishness. The walk to her grandmother's small house on Maple Street took 15 minutes past the high school, where she and Jake had once shared stolen kisses under the bleachers past the library, where she'd spent countless hours dreaming of becoming a writer, past all the ghosts of a life she'd left behind. Grandma May's house looked smaller than Emma remembered, its blue paint faded and peeling in places. The garden that had once been her grandmother's pride was now overgrown with weeds, though someone had clearly been trying to maintain it with varying degrees of success. Emma climbed the familiar porch steps, noting the new handrail that hadn't been there 8 years ago, and knocked softly on the door she'd once run through without hesitation. "Come in, dear. It's open." Her grandmother's voice was thinner than Emma remembered, but still carried that warm note of welcome that had made this house feel like home when nowhere else would. Emma stepped inside, and the scent of jasmine tea and old books wrapped around her like a hug. Grandma May sat in her favorite armchair by the window, smaller and more fragile than Emma's memories suggested, but her dark eyes still sharp and knowing. "My little flower, you came home." The endearment in Mandarin broke something inside Emma's chest. She dropped her suitcases and crossed the room in 3 quick steps, kneeling beside the chair to wrap her arms around the tiny woman who'd taught her that love didn't require blood relation. "I'm so sorry I stayed away so long, Nine. I'm so sorry." Gentle fingers stroked her hair the same way they had when Emma was 8 years old and crying over her father's departure. "Shh, child. You're here now. That's what matters." They sat together in comfortable silence as the afternoon light shifted across the worn hardwood floors. Emma studied her grandmother's face, cataloging the changes 8 years had brought. The lines were deeper, the hands more fragile, but there was still a spark of the woman who'd single-handedly raised a grieving child while working double shifts at the diner. Tell me about your writing, Grandma May said eventually. Are you happy with your work? Emma hesitated. How could she explain that her journalism career consisted mainly of writing product reviews for obscure websites and the occasional local interest piece that paid barely enough to cover her rent? How could she admit that the dreams they'd once shared of Emma becoming a renowned journalist had crumbled into a series of rejections and compromises? It's challenging, she said finally. The industry is changing so fast. Her grandmother nodded knowingly. And what about love? Have you found someone who makes your heart sing? Emma's laugh was bitter. Love seems to be the one story I can't figure out how to write nine-eye. Grandma May's eyes grew distant. Love is like tending a garden. It requires patience, forgiveness, and sometimes starting over with the same soil. Something in her tone made Emma look up sharply, but her grandmother's expression had already shifted to something lighter. Are you hungry? I made your favorite soup, though I'm afraid my hands aren't as steady as they once were. Emma spent the rest of the afternoon helping her grandmother prepare dinner, falling back into domestic rhythms that felt both foreign and familiar. They spoke carefully around the diagnosis, both pretending that Grandma May hadn't forgotten Emma's name twice during their conversation, both acting as though the medical papers scattered across the kitchen table were nothing more than routine paperwork. It wasn't until evening, as Emma was unpacking her things in her childhood bedroom, that she found the box. It was sitting on her old desk, tied with a red ribbon that looked freshly placed. Inside, she discovered a collection of items that made her breath catch: her high school diploma, a pressed corsage from senior prom, a photo of her and Jake at the town's harvest festival, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's view, and at the bottom a thick manila envelope with her name written in her grandmother's careful script. Emma's hands trembled as she opened the envelope and pulled out its contents: college brochures, scholarship applications, and a letter that made her heart stop. It was addressed to the Cedar Falls High School Scholarship Committee, dated 8 years ago, and signed by Mrs. Rebecca Thornfield, Emma's senior English teacher. As Emma read, the room seemed to spin around her. While Miss Chen shows promise as a writer, I must express concerns about her character and dedication. Recent events have shown a pattern of irresponsible behavior that makes me question whether she deserves our institution's highest academic honor. I recommend the Paru Scholarship be awarded to a more deserving candidate. Emma sank onto her childhood bed, the letter fluttering from her numb fingers. Mrs. Thornfield, not Jake. All these years, she'd blamed Jake Morrison for the cruel twist of fate that had cost her the scholarship to Columbia's journalism program. All these years, she'd carried the anger and betrayal like a festering wound, certain that his father's influence and money had somehow stolen her future. But it hadn't been Jake at all. The recent events Mrs. Thornfield referenced were clear enough. Emma remembered that spring perfectly. The way her grades had slipped after her grandmother's minor heart attack, the days she'd missed school to help with medical appointments, the tearful breakdown she'd had in Mrs. Thornfield's classroom when the stress became too much to bear. Mrs. Thornfield had seen weakness and called it character failure. And Emma had spent 8 years hating the wrong person. She picked up the photo of her and Jake studying his face in the fading light. They'd been so young, so certain that their love could survive anything. She remembered the weight of his Letterman jacket around her shoulders, the way he'd promised they'd figure out college together, find a way to make their dreams compatible. Instead, she'd accused him of sabotaging her scholarship application, had screamed at him in the school parking lot, while half their graduating class watched, had told him she never wanted to see his face again. He tried to explain, had insisted he didn't know anything about the scholarship decision, but she'd been too hurt and angry to listen. Too proud to believe that someone she trusted could see her as anything less than worthy. The guilt hit her like a physical pain. 8 years of anger based on a lie, 8 years of avoiding this place, this home, because she couldn't bear the thought of seeing him again. Emma walked to her bedroom window and looked out across the darkening fields toward the Morrison Ranch. Lights flickered in the distance, warm and welcoming in the growing dusk. Somewhere out there, Jake was probably finishing his evening chores, settling in for another quiet night in the town she'd been so desperate to escape. Did he hate her? Did he even think about her anymore? Or had he moved on? Found someone who wouldn't abandon him over a misunderstanding, built the kind of life she'd always been too afraid to want? The questions swirled through her mind as she prepared for bed, as she lay staring at the ceiling of her childhood room, listening to the sounds of a house settling into sleep. Tomorrow she would focus on her grandmother, on making the most of whatever time they had left together. But eventually she would have to face the past she'd run from. She would have to face Jake Morrison. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn sky that made Montana feel like the edge of the world. Emma woke to the sound of her grandmother moving around the kitchen, humming an old Chinese lullaby that brought back memories of childhood mornings and the safety of routine. She found Grandma May at the stove, attempting to flip pancakes with shaking hands. Emma gently took the spatula and finished the task, noting how her grandmother seemed more fragile in the morning light, as though the night had stolen a little more of her strength. "Did you sleep well, dear?" Emma nodded, not mentioning the hours she'd spent staring at the ceiling, wrestling with revelations and regrets. "The bed feels smaller than I remembered." Everything feels smaller when we grow up. Or perhaps we just grow larger hearts that need more space to hold all our experiences. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, though Emma noticed her grandmother pushing the food around her plate more than eating it. Another reminder that time was not on their side, that every moment together was borrowed from a future that grew shorter with each passing day. "I thought we might go into town today," Emma suggested. "Maybe visit the library, see what's changed." Her grandmother's face lit up. "Oh, that would be lovely. I haven't been in weeks. My legs aren't where they used to be, and the walk seems longer each time." It was only a 6-block walk to the library, but Emma could see what her grandmother meant. The woman who'd once walked miles every day to work now moved carefully, pausing frequently to catch her breath. Emma adjusted her pace, pretending to be interested in the changes to various storefronts, when really she was simply giving Grandma May time to rest. The library looked exactly the same as Emma remembered, a small brick building with tall windows and the slightly musty smell of old books and dreams. Mrs. Rodriguez, the librarian, greeted them with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely had visitors, and Emma found herself swept into conversations about her travels, her writing, her plans for the future. It was while her grandmother was browsing the large print section that Emma noticed the bulletin board near the front desk. Local announcements, lost pet flyers, and prominently displayed in the center, a newspaper clipping that made her stomach drop. Morrison Ranch faces uncertain future. The article was brief but devastating. Jake's father had died 6 months ago, leaving behind significant medical debts and a ranch struggling to stay profitable in an increasingly difficult market. There were hints of health issues, of Jake potentially having to sell the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. Emma stared at the clipping, guilt and sympathy warring in her chest. While she'd been nursing her anger in Portland, building walls around her heart and blaming him for her failures, Jake had been here facing losses she couldn't imagine. His father, his future, everything that had once seemed solid and permanent in his life. "Sad story, isn't it?" Emma turned to find Mrs. Rodriguez standing beside her, following her gaze to the article. "Jake Morrison was such a sweet boy," the librarian continued. "Always helping his father with the ranch work, never complained even when the other kids were out having fun. And now this. Sometimes life just isn't fair." Is he okay?" Emma asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "Oh, he's managing. Too proud to ask for help, of course. That's the Morrison way. But I heard from Miguel Santos, you remember Miguel, he works the ranch, that Jake's been pushing himself too hard, working dawn to dusk, trying to keep everything together on his own." Emma nodded absently, her mind racing. She thought about the prank Mrs. Patterson had mentioned yesterday about teenagers targeting the ranch. In high school, pranks had been harmless fun. Toilet papering trees, moving lawn ornaments, filling someone's locker with balloons. But if Jake was already struggling, dealing with grief and financial pressure, even minor harassment could feel overwhelming. An idea began to form in her mind, a terrible, impulsive idea that felt both like justice and revenge. Jake Morrison had spent 8 years believing she'd left town, hating him for something he didn't do. He'd probably moved on, forgotten all about their teenage romance and the girl who'd broken his heart over a misunderstanding. But Emma remembered how much he'd hated being embarrassed, how seriously he'd always taken his reputation and his family's standing in the community. Maybe it was time Jake Morrison experienced a little embarrassment of his own. That evening, Emma volunteered to make a grocery run, leaving her grandmother settled with her favorite television program and a cup of tea. But instead of heading directly to the store, she made a detour that took her past the high school and out toward the country roads that led to the Morrison Ranch. She parked her grandmother's old Honda at the end of the long driveway and studied the property in the fading light. The ranch looked exactly as she remembered, a sprawling two-story house with a wraparound porch, several outbuildings, and endless rolling pastures dotted with cattle. But there were signs of struggle if you knew how to look. Peeling paint on the barn, a sagging fence that needed repair equipment that seemed older and more worn than it should be. Emma's plan was simple, almost childishly so. She'd brought supplies from town, biodegradable paint that would wash off with the first rain enough to cover Jake's truck and maybe the front porch with messages that would embarrass him in front of the whole town. Nothing permanently damaging, nothing that would actually hurt him, just a reminder that actions had consequences and that some people had long memories. She crept across the property, moving carefully to avoid the motion sensor lights that Jake had obviously installed as protection against the other pranksters. Her heart pounded with a mixture of adrenaline and guilt, but she pushed the latter feeling aside. This was justice, she told herself. This was 8 years of anger finally finding a target. It wasn't until she reached the main barn that she realized her mistake. The building wasn't empty as she'd expected. Light spilled from the open doors, and she could hear sounds from inside. Not the quiet movements of someone doing evening chores, but the frantic activity of crisis management. Emma crept closer, telling herself she was just making sure the coast was clear, but really driven by curiosity about what could be happening at this hour. What she saw through the barn doors made her forget all about her plan for revenge. Jake Morrison knelt in the center of the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hands covered in blood. Around him, a circle of newborn calves lay on beds of fresh straw, some moving weakly, others ominously still. A veterinarian Emma didn't recognize worked frantically over one of the animals, while Jake assisted, his face grim with concentration and something that looked like desperation. "We're losing too many," the vet said quietly. "Whatever contaminated the water system hit them hard. I've done what I can, but..." Jake's shoulders sagged. "How many?" "Maybe half. The ones that make it through the night have a chance, but it's going to be touch and go." Emma watched Jake stroke the head of a calf that was clearly dying, his gentle touch, at odds with his reputation as the town's golden boy, who'd had everything handed to him. She'd never seen him look so tired, so defeated, so utterly alone. The paint cans in her hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. What had she been thinking? This man wasn't her enemy. He was someone fighting to save lives, to preserve something precious in the face of impossible odds. And she'd come here to humiliate him for a crime he'd never committed. She started to back away, intending to return to her car and forget this whole foolish plan, but her foot caught on something in the darkness, a garden hose she hadn't seen in the shadows. She stumbled, overcorrected, and crashed directly into a piece of farm equipment that sent the paint cans flying. The resulting noise sounded like the end of the world in the quiet night. Every light on the property blazed to life simultaneously. Dogs began barking from somewhere near the house, and Jake Morrison appeared in the barn doorway, backlit and furious-looking, exactly like the avenging angel of Emma's nightmares. "Who's there? I'm armed, and I'm calling the sheriff." Emma froze like a deer in headlights, paint-stained and guilty, caught red-handed in the act of, well, something that looked a lot worse than what she'd actually been planning. Jake stepped closer, and she saw the exact moment recognition dawned in his eyes. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally something that might have been hurt. "Emma Chen," he said quietly. "I should have known." Should have known what? Emma found her voice finally, though it came out smaller and more defensive than she'd intended. Jake gestured to the paint cans scattered around her feet, their contents now forming abstract patterns across the gravel. "That you'd come back to finish what you started here 8 years ago." The accusation stung, partly because it wasn't entirely wrong. She had come here for revenge, even if the reality of seeing him again had changed everything. "It's not what it looks like," she said lamely. "Really, because it looks like Emma Chen, who left town swearing she'd make me pay for ruining her life, showed up at my ranch in the middle of the night with paint cans and vandalism on her mind." When he put it like that, it did sound pretty damning. Emma looked down at her paint-stained hands, then back up at Jake's face. 8 years had changed him. His shoulders were broader, his jaw more defined, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of hard work and harder losses. But his eyes were the same clear gray she remembered, even though they now looked at her with wariness instead of love. "You're right," she said finally. That's exactly what this looks like, but I changed my mind. How convenient, right after you got caught. Emma felt her temper flare, the same quick anger that had gotten her into trouble all those years ago. I changed my mind before you caught me, actually, when I saw she gestured toward the barn where the veterinarian was still working. What happened? Jake's expression didn't soften, but some of the hostility left his voice. Water system got contaminated, lost 17 calves in the past 3 days, and these are the last of the ones that might make it. I'm sorry, Emma said and meant it. That's, that's terrible. Yeah, well, it's been a terrible year all around. Jake rubbed his face with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of dirt across his cheek. Look, Emma, I don't know why you're really here, and honestly, I don't have the energy to care right now. If you want to paint nasty messages on my truck, go ahead. In the grand scheme of things I'm dealing with, it's pretty minor. The defeat in his voice was worse than anger would have been. This wasn't the Jake Morrison she remembered. Confident, untouchable, but always sure that everything would work out in his favor. This was a man at the end of his rope, holding on by sheer stubbornness and not much else. Jake, she said gently, I didn't come here to hurt you. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Then why did you come? Because last time we talked, you made it pretty clear you never wanted to see me again. Emma opened her mouth to explain about the letter about Mrs. Thornfield and the scholarship and 8 years of misplaced anger, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain that she'd been wrong about everything when he was clearly dealing with real problems that made their high school drama seem trivial? Before she could figure out what to say, the veterinarian emerged from the barn, pulling off blood-stained gloves with the weary movements of someone who'd done everything possible. That's all I can do for tonight, Jake. The ones that are going to make it should be stronger by morning. I'll stop by tomorrow to check on them. Jake nodded, walking the vet to his truck and speaking in low tones that Emma couldn't overhear. She stood uncertainly in the circle of light from the barn, surrounded by evidence of her failed revenge plot and feeling increasingly foolish. When Jake returned, his face was carefully neutral. Doctor Martinez says it'll be several more hours before we know which calves are going to pull through. Someone needs to stay with them, make sure they're warm, help them nurse if they're strong enough. You've been up all night, Emma observed. You need sleep. Sleep's a luxury I can't afford right now. If I lose these calves too. He didn't finish the sentence, but Emma could fill in the blanks. If he lost these calves, he might lose everything. Emma made a decision that surprised them both. I'll help. Jake stared at her. What? I'll help you watch them. I know it's been a long time, but I remember helping with lambing season at the Peterson farm during high school. I know how to bottle feed animals and recognize signs of distress. Emma, you don't have to. I want to, she interrupted. Please, let me help. For a long moment, they looked at each other across the years and misunderstandings that stretched between them. Emma saw the exact moment Jake decided to trust her, even though she probably didn't deserve it. Okay, he said finally. Thank you. They worked through the night in the warm circle of light inside the barn, moving among the newborn calves with the careful choreography of people who understood that lives hung in the balance. Emma had forgotten how much she'd once loved this kind of work. The quiet satisfaction of caring for vulnerable creatures, the way time seemed to slow and focus on the essential rhythms of breathing and heartbeat. Jake worked mostly in silence, but Emma caught him watching her sometimes, as though he couldn't quite believe she was really there. She didn't blame him. She could hardly believe it herself. Around 3 in the morning, they lost one of the weakest calves despite their efforts. Emma knelt beside the small body, tears unexpectedly blurring her vision as Jake gently covered it with a blanket. I'm sorry, she whispered. Not your fault, Jake said quietly. Sometimes you do everything right and still lose them. That's ranching. But Emma wasn't just crying for the calf. She was crying for Jake's father, for her grandmother's diagnosis, for 8 years of anger and misunderstanding, for all the time they'd wasted being apart when life was already so fragile and brief. Jake surprised her by sitting down beside her on the hay bales, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I missed you, he said suddenly. All this time, even after everything that happened, I missed you. Emma's breath caught. Jake, I know you hate me. I understand why. But I need you to know that I never sabotaged your scholarship. I swear on my father's grave, Emma, I had nothing to do with that decision. I know, she whispered. He went very still. What? Emma reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the letter she'd been carrying since yesterday, the one that had changed everything. With trembling fingers, she handed it to Jake and watched his face as he read. When he finished, he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Mrs. Thornfield. Mrs. Thornfield, Emma confirmed. I found the letter yesterday in my grandmother's things. I've been wrong about you for 8 years, Jake. I'm so sorry. He was quiet for so long that Emma began to worry she'd waited too long to tell him that the damage was too great to repair. But finally, he folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. Why didn't you stay? He asked. When you lost the scholarship, why didn't you stay and go to the community college like we planned? We could have figured it out together. Emma stared down at her hands. Because I was humiliated. Because I thought you'd betrayed me, and I couldn't bear the thought of seeing you every day knowing that the person I loved had chosen to hurt me. Because I was 18 and dramatic and convinced that leaving was the only way to prove I was strong enough to survive without help from anyone. And now I know that leaving was the coward's choice, that I hurt you as much as I thought you'd hurt me, maybe more, that I spent 8 years building a life around anger and running away, and I don't have much to show for either. Jake reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused from years of ranch work. You became a writer. That was always your dream. Emma's laugh was bitter. Barely. I write product reviews and the occasional human interest piece for small newspapers. It's not exactly the investigative journalism career we used to talk about. But you're writing, Jake insisted. You're using your words to tell stories even if they're not the stories you thought you'd tell. That matters. The kindness in his voice was almost more than she could bear. How had she convinced herself that this man was her enemy? How had she carried anger for so long towards someone who'd only ever wanted the best for her? One of the calves nearby made a small sound and they both turned their attention back to the work at hand. But something had shifted between them. Some wall had cracked, if not fallen entirely. They moved through the remaining hours of the night with a new ease, talking quietly about safe topics, changes in the town, mutual friends from high school. Carefully neutral memories that didn't carry too much emotional weight. By dawn, they'd saved 4 of the 6 remaining calves. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the barn doors, Emma watched Jake check each animal one final time, his movements gentle despite his obvious exhaustion. They're going to make it, she said. Looks like it. He straightened, wincing slightly as his back protested the long night of crouching and lifting. Thank you, Emma. I couldn't have done this alone. Yes, you could have, she said firmly. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. They stood facing each other in the golden morning light, paint-stained and exhausted, surrounded by the evidence of life preserved against the odds. Emma felt something stirring in her chest, a warmth she'd thought she'd lost forever, a sense of rightness she hadn't experienced in 8 years. I should go, she said reluctantly. My grandmother will be wondering where I am. Jake nodded but didn't move to see her out. Emma, will I see you again, while you're in town? The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and 8 years of unfinished business. Emma thought about her grandmother's words about love being like tending a garden, about sometimes starting over with the same soil. Yes, she said simply, you'll see me again. As she walked back to her car, Emma felt lighter than she had in years. The prank that had brought her here had failed spectacularly, but maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. Maybe some mistakes were meant to lead you exactly where you belonged. Behind her, Jake Morrison stood in the doorway of his barn watching her drive away as the Montana sun climbed higher in the big sky, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. Emma woke to the sound of her grandmother humming in the kitchen and the unfamiliar ache of muscles she'd forgotten she had. The night at the Morrison Ranch felt like a dream, except for the lingering scent of hay on her clothes and the way her heart jumped every time she thought about Jake's quiet, I missed you. She found Grandma May at the breakfast table, staring at a bowl of oatmeal with the confused expression that had become increasingly common. For a moment, the older woman's eyes were completely blank, as though she was looking at a stranger. Nai, Emma said gently, using the Mandarin term for grandmother that had always been their special connection. The confusion cleared like clouds parting. There you are, dear. I was wondering where you'd gone. Emma's chest tightened. She'd left a note explaining about the grocery run, but clearly her grandmother didn't remember. Another piece of their shared history disappearing into the growing darkness of Alzheimer's. Just ran some errands, Emma said lightly, settling into the chair across from her grandmother. How are you feeling this morning? Oh, you know me. Old bones complaining about the weather. Grandma May's smile was warm, but Emma noticed the tremor in her hands as she lifted her spoon. I had the strangest dream last night, though, about your grandfather. Emma went very still. Her grandmother had never talked much about Emma's grandfather, who had died when Emma was a baby. The few times Emma had asked Grandma May had changed the subject with the skill of someone who'd had years of practice, avoiding painful topics. What kind of dream? We were young again, maybe 22 or 23. We were dancing in his family's barn. You know, the Morrison barn out on Ranch Road. And he was telling me about all the places we had traveled together. Grandma May's eyes grew distant. Such a foolish dream. I haven't thought about Robert in years. Emma's coffee cup slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Robert, she whispered. Robert Morrison. Her grandmother blinked, seeming to come back to the present. Oh my, what a mess. Let me help you clean that up. No, Nye, stay seated. I've got it. Emma knelt to gather the ceramic pieces, her mind reeling. You said Robert Morrison. Was Grandpa's last name Morrison? But when she looked up, her grandmother was staring at her with that blank confusion again, as though the conversation had never happened. I'm sorry, dear. What were we talking about? Emma forced a smile and finished cleaning up the coffee, but her thoughts were spinning. Robert Morrison. Jake's grandfather had been named Robert. She remembered that from family stories Jake had told her in high school. But surely it was just a coincidence. Morrison was a common enough name, and Robert even more so. Except Grandma May had specifically mentioned the Morrison barn, and there had been something in her voice when she talked about traveling together, a wistful sadness that Emma had never heard before. After breakfast, Emma helped her grandmother with her medications and settled her with her favorite television program. Then she walked to the local newspaper office, a cramped building that housed the Cedar Falls Gazette and served as the unofficial repository of town history. Mrs. Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had been the newspaper's editor for 30 years. She greeted Emma with the enthusiasm of someone desperate for interesting conversation. Emma, how wonderful to see you. I heard you were back in town. How's your dear grandmother? She's managing, Emma said diplomatically. Actually, I was hoping you might help me with something. I'm trying to piece together some family history, and I think there might be records here. Of course, what are you looking for? Emma hesitated, feeling foolish. Marriage records from the 1950s, specifically anyone named Robert Morrison who might have married a Chinese woman. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose, but she led Emma to the archives without comment. They spent an hour digging through old newspaper files, birth announcements, and society pages yellowed with age. They found it in a 1952 edition buried in the social announcements. Robert Morrison, son of James and Margaret Morrison of Morrison Ranch, has announced his engagement to Miss May Chen, recently arrived from San Francisco. Emma stared at the announcement, her world tilting on its axis. There was even a photograph, a young man who looked remarkably like Jake, standing beside a beautiful Chinese woman who was unmistakably Emma's grandmother. But they didn't marry, Mrs. Chen said gently, reading over Emma's shoulder. I remember the story now. Such a scandal at the time. The Morrison family was completely against it. Mixed-race marriages weren't exactly accepted in 1952 Montana. Robert's father threatened to disown him. What happened? Robert left town, joined the military, I think. May married someone else, your grandfather, and Robert never came back. At least not until... Until what? Mrs. Chen looked uncomfortable. Well, this is just gossip, you understand, but some people say Robert Morrison came back to Cedar Falls about 26 years ago, just for a few days. He never went to the ranch, never contacted his family. But old Mrs. Patterson swears she saw him at the diner where your grandmother worked. 26 years ago, right around the time Emma was born. Emma's hand shook as she carefully folded the newspaper clipping. Mrs. Chen, do you happen to know what became of Robert Morrison? Oh dear, he died years ago, Vietnam, I believe. Such a waste. Emma nodded numbly and thanked Mrs. Chen for her help. She walked home in a daze, the newspaper clipping burning like a secret in her pocket. Her grandmother was asleep in her chair, when Emma returned looking small and fragile in the afternoon light. Emma studied her face, searching for any resemblance to the Morrison family features she knew so well. Had Jake's grandfather been Emma's grandfather too? Was that why Grandma May had been so understanding about Emma's teenage romance, so heartbroken when it ended? The possibility was staggering. If it was true, then she and Jake were, what, step-cousins? Was there even a term for their relationship if their grandparents had been engaged but never married? Emma's phone buzzed with a text message, startling her from her thoughts. Calves are doing well. Thank you again for last night. Jake. She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the reply button. How was she supposed to respond? How could she face Jake again, knowing what she suspected? How could she not tell him? Before she could lose her nerve, she typed back, I'm glad they're okay. Can we talk? There's something I need to discuss with you. His response came quickly. Of course, tonight after dinner. I'll pick you up at 7. Emma spent the rest of the afternoon helping her grandmother with small tasks around the house, trying to act normal while her mind churned. When Grandma May had one of her clearer moments, Emma almost asked her directly about Robert Morrison. But something held her back. Maybe respect for her grandmother's privacy, maybe fear of the answer. At 7 o'clock sharp, Jake's truck pulled into the driveway. Emma watched him walk to the front door, noting the way he moved with careful precision, as though he was in pain. When she opened the door, she saw exhaustion etched in every line of his face. You look terrible, she said by way of greeting. He smiled, and for a moment he looked like the beau she'd once loved. Always the charmer, ready to go. They drove in comfortable silence through the gathering dusk, past fields where cattle grazed peacefully, and the mountains stood sentinel against the darkening sky. Jake didn't ask where they were going. He simply drove the familiar roads of their shared childhood, eventually pulling over at the overlook where they'd spent countless evenings as teenagers. The town spread out below them, lights beginning to twinkle in windows as families settled in for the evening. In the distance, the Morrison Ranch was a cluster of warm lights against the darkness. This is where you brought me the night before graduation, Emma said softly. You remember? I remember everything. She turned to face him in the dim light of the truck's cab. Jake, there is something I need to tell you, something I discovered today. He went very still, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Okay, Emma pulled out the newspaper clipping and handed it to him. I think our grandparents were engaged. Jake studied the photograph in the fading light, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with something Emma couldn't identify. You think Robert Morrison was your grandfather? I don't know for sure. My grandmother has Alzheimer's and her memories, they come and go. But she mentioned him this morning, said she dreamed about dancing with him in the Morrison barn. And then I found this. Emma, Jake interrupted gently. I know. She stared at him. What? I've known for years. My grandfather left letters, photographs. He never stopped loving your grandmother even after he married my grandmother and started a family. Jake's voice was quiet, careful. He came back to see her once right after you were born. He wanted to know if you might be his daughter instead of the man she'd married. Emma felt the world spin around her. Are you saying? I'm saying your mother looks exactly like my grandfather did at that age. I'm saying my father used to joke that you had Morrison eyes. I'm saying that when you and I were dating, my grandfather pulled me aside and told me to be very, very careful with you because you might be family. Why didn't you tell me? Jake was quiet for a long moment. Because you were 18 and already dealing with your father leaving. Because my grandfather made me promise never to tell anyone while your grandmother was alive. He said it was her secret to tell, keep. And because, he paused, looking down at his hands. Because I was selfish. I was in love with you, and I was afraid that if you knew we might be related, you'd leave. Emma pressed her hands to her face, trying to process everything. So when I accused you of sabotaging my scholarship, I couldn't defend myself without betraying my grandfather's confidence. I couldn't tell you the real reason my family seemed to disapprove of our relationship without revealing a secret that wasn't mine to tell. Oh, Jake. Emma felt tears burning behind her eyes. I'm so sorry for all of it, for not trusting you, for leaving, for staying away so long. Hey. Jake reached over and gently pulled her hands away from her face. We were kids. We made mistakes. But Emma, I need you to know, even if we are related by blood, Even if your grandfather was my grandfather too, it doesn't change how I feel about you. Emma looked into his eyes, seeing the same steadfast love that had sustained her through their teenage years. It doesn't change how I feel about you either. They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped across the center console of the truck, while the implications of their discovery settled around them. What do we do now? Emma asked finally. Now we take this one day at a time. We figure out how to help your grandmother while she's still with us. We save my ranch if we can. We learn how to be in each other's lives again. Jake's thumb traced circles across her knuckles. And maybe if we're very lucky, we figure out how to build something new on the foundation of everything we used to be. Emma squeezed his hand, feeling hope bloom in her chest for the first time in years. I'd like that. Over the next few days, Emma fell into a routine that felt both foreign and familiar. Mornings with her grandmother, helping with meals and medications, and the small tasks that had become increasingly difficult. Afternoons spent researching freelance opportunities and trying to salvage her writing career from a distance. And evenings belonged to Jake. He would arrive after finishing his ranch work, usually around sunset, and they would sit on Grandma May's front porch talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes they discussed practical matters, her grandmother's care, his financial struggles, the uncertain future facing them both. Other times they simply remembered sharing stories from their years apart, filling in the gaps that separation had created. It was during one of these evening conversations that Emma first noticed Jake's hands shaking. He was reaching for his coffee cup when it happened, a slight tremor that he quickly disguised by clasping his hands together. Emma might have missed it if she hadn't been watching him so carefully, cataloging all the ways 8 years had changed him. Jake, are you okay? Just tired, he said quickly. Long day. But Emma had seen the flash of something in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or guilt. The same expression she'd noticed when he thought she wasn't looking, the careful way he moved sometimes, as though his body was betraying him in small but significant ways. Over the next few evenings, Emma began to pay closer attention. The way Jake sometimes paused mid-sentence, as though searching for words that used to come easily. The careful way he navigated steps in dim light. The reading glasses he'd started wearing, claiming they were just for fine print, even though Emma remembered his eyesight being perfect in high school. It was Grandma May, in one of her increasingly rare moments of clarity, who finally voiced what Emma was beginning to suspect. That boy's sick, she said one afternoon, watching Jake work in their garden from the kitchen window. Sick in the same way his grandfather was toward the end. Emma's blood went cold. What do you mean, nai? But her grandmother was already drifting back into confusion, her eyes losing focus as the moment of clarity passed. That evening, Emma confronted Jake directly. There's something you're not telling me, she said without preamble, as he settled into his usual chair on the porch. Jake went very still. Emma, your hands shake sometimes. You've been wearing reading glasses. Yesterday, I saw you stumble on perfectly leveled ground. Emma's voice was steady, but her heart was racing. What's wrong, Jake? What aren't you telling me? For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he sighed a sound so full of defeat that it broke Emma's heart. Stargardt disease, he said quietly. It's a genetic condition that affects the retina. Progressive vision loss, usually starting in young adulthood. Emma felt the world tilt. Vision loss. Jake, are you going blind? Eventually, yes. The timeline varies, but most people with Stargardt are legally blind by 40. His voice was matter-of-fact, as though he was discussing the weather. I was diagnosed 2 years ago, right after my father's cancer diagnosis. Perfect timing, really. 2 years ago, Jake, why didn't you tell anyone? What was I supposed to say? Hey, town, not only is my father dying, but I'm also going blind, and will probably have to sell the ranch that's been in our family for 3 generations, because I won't be able to run it much longer. Jake's laugh was bitter. People have enough problems without taking on mine. Emma stared at him, pieces falling into place. That's why you've been pushing yourself so hard. You're trying to save the ranch before I can't anymore, yes. I figure I have maybe 2 years of functional vision left, 3, if I'm lucky. After that, he shrugged. After that, I'll have to find a different way to make a living. Somewhere other than Cedar Falls, probably. Jake, no. Emma reached for his hands, holding them tightly. You can't just give up. There has to be something. Treatments, adaptations, ways to modify ranch work. Emma, I can barely see the difference between a healthy calf and a sick one anymore. Yesterday, I nearly walked into a fence post because I didn't see it. This isn't something that gets better with positive thinking. Emma felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. Then we find another way. We adapt. We figure out how to make it work. Jake's voice was very quiet. Yes, you're not doing this alone anymore, Jake Morrison. I'm not leaving again. Jake pulled his hands free and stood up, pacing to the edge of the porch. Emma, you can't make promises like that. You have a life, a career. I have a handful of freelance clients who pay me poverty wages to write about products I've never used. That's not a career, Jake. That's just existing. Emma stood and moved to stand beside him. But this, being here with you, with my grandmother, this feels like living. You'll get tired of it, of me, of taking care of people who can't take care of themselves. Emma turned to face him, fully forcing him to meet her eyes. Is that what you think, that loving someone means you'll eventually get tired of them when things get difficult? Isn't that what happened with your father? The question hit like a physical blow. Emma's father had left when her grandmother's first husband died, and she'd needed Emma's family to help with the funeral arrangements and settling affairs. He'd claimed the drama was too much, that he couldn't handle the responsibility of an extended family with complicated needs. My father was a coward, Emma said fiercely. I'm not him, and you're not a burden, Jake. You're the person I love, and love doesn't come with conditions or expiration dates. Jake stared at her for a long moment, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. You love me? I never stopped loving you. Even when I hated you, I loved you. Even when I was trying to build a life without you, part of me was always hoping I'd find my way back. Emma reached up to cup his face in her hands. I love you, Jake Morrison. All of you. The parts that are changing and the parts that never will. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home and starting over all at the same time. Emma tasted salt on his lips and realized they were both crying. For the years they'd lost, for the challenges ahead, for the simple relief of not having to face the future alone. They were interrupted by the sound of applause from the kitchen window. Emma pulled back to see her grandmother watching them with a lucid smile, clapping her hands together like a delighted child. About time, Grandma May called out. I was beginning to think you two would never figure it out. Emma laughed, wiping tears from her eyes. How long has she been watching? Long enough, Jake set his arm around Emma's waist. Your grandmother always was too smart for her own good. Must run in the family, Emma said, looking up at him with a smile that felt like sunshine after years of rain. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Emma was helping her grandmother with breakfast when Jake's truck roared into the driveway, moving faster than was safe on the gravel road. He burst through the front door without knocking, his face flushed with excitement and something that might have been panic. Emma, I need to show you something. Right now. What's wrong? Is it the calves? No, the calves are fine. Jake ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Emma remembered from their teenage years when he was too excited to form coherent sentences. Just come with me, both of you, he added, looking at Grandma May. You need to see this too. They drove to the Morrison Ranch in Jake's truck, Grandma May sitting between them on the bench seat like a tiny chaperone. Emma noticed that Jake was driving more slowly than usual, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, and she realized he was struggling to see clearly in the bright morning light. Instead of stopping at the main house, Jake drove them to a section of the property Emma had never seen before. A small hill topped with an old oak tree and surrounded by what looked like the remains of a stone foundation. What is this place? Emma asked as Jake helped her grandmother out of the truck. This is where my great-grandfather built the original homestead, Jake said, before they moved to the current house location. I've been meaning to clean it up, maybe restore it as a historical site, but I never had the time or money. He led them to the base of the oak tree where someone had recently been digging. A metal box sat beside a neat hole in the earth, its contents spread out on a blanket like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Emma knelt beside the collection, her breath catching as she recognized what she was seeing. Photographs, letters, and jewelry that clearly dated from the 1950s. In the center of the collection was a wedding dress, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, still beautiful despite its age. I found them yesterday while I was surveying this section for possible sale, Jake said quietly. Someone buried them here years ago, decades ago. Emma picked up one of the photographs and her hands began to shake. It showed her grandmother as a young woman wearing the white dress from the box standing beside Robert Morrison in what was clearly a wedding ceremony. They got married, Emma whispered. They actually got married. Grandma May moved closer, her eyes suddenly sharp and focused in a way Emma hadn't seen in weeks. She reached for one of the letters with trembling fingers, unfolding it carefully. I remember, she said softly. We eloped. Just the two of us and a justice of the peace in Helena. We knew his family would never accept it, that mine would be furious. So we did it in secret and planned to tell everyone later. Emma looked up at Jake, seeing her own shock reflected in his face. What happened? Why didn't anyone know? The telegram, Grandma May said, her voice growing distant with memory. 3 days after we married, Robert got the telegram. He'd been drafted. Vietnam was escalating, and they needed him immediately. She sank down onto the blanket, handling the artifacts like precious relics. He left the next morning. We barely had time to say goodbye. I moved back in with my family and told them the wedding had been called off. Robert said we'd announce everything when he came home. But he never came home, Jake said gently. He did once, 2 years later on leave. That's when... Grandma May looked at Emma with eyes that held their old sharpness. That's when your mother was conceived. But Robert was different after the war. Damaged. He said he couldn't ask me to build a life with someone who might never be whole again. Emma felt tears rolling down her cheeks. So you let everyone think you'd never married. You raised my mother alone. I wasn't alone. I met your grandfather, your mother's stepfather, a year later. He was a good man, kind and gentle. He knew about Robert, about the marriage that never really existed in the world's eyes, but he didn't care. He loved your mother as his own. That's why you kept the Chen name, Emma realized, even after you married my step-grandfather. Grandma May nodded. I couldn't take another name that wasn't legally mine. And in my heart, I was always May Morrison, even if I could never claim it. Jake sat down heavily on the ground beside them, the weight of revelation clearly overwhelming him. So you and Emma are not blood relatives, Grandma May said firmly. Your grandfather was Robert Morrison. Emma's grandfather was Chen, my second husband. Robert was Emma's grandmother's first husband, which makes you and Emma nothing more than two people who love each other. Emma felt a laugh bubble up from her chest, followed immediately by more tears. All this time we were worried about being related, when you're actually step-grandchildren-in-law, or something equally meaningless. Jake finished his own laughter, shaky with relief. Grandma May reached into the collection and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a wedding ring, simple but beautiful, clearly handmade with care. Robert made this for me himself, she said, slipping it onto her finger, where it still fit perfectly after all these years. I buried it all here after I married Lee, thought it was the right thing to do. But I always knew where it was. You've been carrying this secret for over 50 years, Emma said softly. Some secrets are too heavy to carry alone, her grandmother replied, and some are too precious to share until the right time comes. They sat together in the shadow of the oak tree, 3 generations connected by love and loss, and the complicated ways families are made and remade across time. Emma thought about the different kinds of family, the one you're born into, the one you choose, the one you create through love and commitment, in the simple decision to stay when things get difficult. What do we do now? Jake asked eventually. Grandma May smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the young woman in the faded photographs. Now we stop burying our love in the ground and start planting it where it can grow. She looked at Emma and Jake with eyes that held all the wisdom of a life fully lived. Now you two stop wasting time on fear and start building the life you both deserve. Right after they packed up the artifacts to take back to the house, Emma felt something shift in her chest. Not just relief about their family history, but a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. She looked at the ranch spread out below them, at Jake moving carefully but determinedly through the world, despite his failing vision, at her grandmother, who had loved quietly and completely for over half a century. This was where she belonged. Not just in Cedar Falls, not just with Jake, but in this specific moment of their intertwined stories, ready to help write whatever came next. The future was uncertain, her grandmother's illness, Jake's condition, the ranch's financial troubles. But for the first time in 8 years, Emma felt ready to face uncertainty with someone else, to build something meaningful on the foundation of everything they'd learned about love and loss and the courage it took to stay. As they drove back toward town, Emma reached for Jake's hand and held it tightly, feeling the slight tremor that spoke of challenges ahead, but also feeling the strength that had sustained him through the worst year of his life, the steadiness that made her believe they could face whatever came next together. The afternoon sun slanted through the truck windows, painting everything in gold, and Emma thought about gardens and soil and the way love could grow anywhere if you tended it with enough care. 3 weeks after the discovery at the oak tree, Emma stood in the Morrison Ranch's kitchen at 5 in the morning, making coffee and watching Jake move through his morning routine with the careful precision of someone adapting to a world that was slowly disappearing. She'd moved into the ranch house the week before, officially to help with the increased workload as they prepared for the fall cattle sale, but really because neither of them wanted to spend another night apart. Grandma May had insisted on the arrangement, claiming that Emma was needed more at the ranch than sitting around watching her waste away in slow motion. The brutal honesty of her grandmother's deteriorating condition had become a daily reality Emma was learning to navigate. Some days Grandma May was sharp and present, dispensing wisdom and gentle teasing with equal measure. Other days she looked at Emma like a stranger and asked for Robert with the heartbreaking confusion of someone whose mind was trapped in a different decade. "You're up early," Jake said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with his hair still messy from sleep. Even in the dim pre-dawn light, Emma could see the way he moved more cautiously than he had just weeks ago, his hand trailing along the wall for guidance. "Couldn't sleep," Emma admitted, pouring him a cup of coffee and pressing it into his hands. "I've been thinking about the Mitchell offer." Jake's expression tightened. Tom Mitchell, a developer from Billings, had made an offer on the Morrison Ranch that would solve all of Jake's financial problems and then some. The catch was that he wanted to subdivide the land for a luxury housing development, turning 3 generations of Morrison heritage into vacation homes for wealthy out-of-state buyers. "It's a good offer, Emma. More than fair." "It's not about the money." Emma moved to stand beside him at the kitchen window, looking out over the rolling pastures where cattle grazed peacefully in the morning mist. "This place is your family's legacy. Your great-grandfather homesteaded this land. Your grandfather and grandmother built their life here. Your father, My father is dead," Jake said quietly, "and I'm going blind. Legacy doesn't pay veterinary bills or keep the lights on." Emma heard the resignation in his voice, the same tone he'd used when talking about his diagnosis. It was the sound of someone who'd gotten used to losing things, who'd learned not to fight too hard against inevitability. What if there was another way? Jake turned to look at her, though Emma noticed he had to angle his head slightly to see her clearly in his peripheral vision. "What kind of other way?" Emma pulled out her laptop and opened it on the kitchen table. Over the past week, she'd been researching and planning, making phone calls and sending emails, building something that felt like hope. "I've been working on a business plan," she said, pulling up a document filled with charts and projections. "What if instead of selling the ranch, we transformed it into what? A sustainable agriculture and education center. We keep the cattle operation, but add diversified farming workshops on traditional ranching techniques, maybe even an artist residency program." Emma's words came faster as her excitement built. "I've been in touch with the State Agricultural Extension Office, and they are interested in partnering with us. There are grants available for sustainable farming initiatives, especially ones that incorporate education and community outreach." Jake studied the screen, though Emma noticed him squinting slightly. "Emma, this is incredibly detailed. How long have you been working on this?" "Since the night you told me about your diagnosis. I couldn't sleep, so I started researching. Did you know that there are ranches all over the country successfully operating with visually impaired owners? The key is adaptation and building the right support systems." Emma pulled up another document, this one filled with testimonials and case studies. "Look at this ranch in Wyoming. The owner lost his sight in an accident 5 years ago, and now he runs a successful operation using audio technology, tactile markers, and a team of trained staff. His productivity actually increased because he had to become more systematic and organized." "Emma?" Jake's voice was heavy with something that might have been hope, if hope could be tinged with fear. "This is amazing work, but the startup costs alone would be covered by the Mitchell offer, Emma finished, but instead of selling the land, we use it as collateral for a business loan. Tom Mitchell isn't the only one with money to invest. I've already reached out to 3 sustainable agriculture investment groups, and 2 of them want to schedule site visits. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as though it could anchor him to something solid. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. Why would you do this? Why would you risk everything on a plan to save a ranch that isn't even yours? Emma felt her heart break a little at the question. Because it is mine, Jake. Maybe not legally, but in every way that matters. This place is part of our story now. Part of my story. And if it fails, if I can't adapt to being blind as well as you think, if the investors pull out or the grants don't come through, then we'll figure something else out. Together. Emma reached for his hands, stilling their slight tremor with her touch. Jake, I'm not asking you to make this decision based on faith alone. I'm asking you to make it based on facts. These programs work. This model is sustainable, and you're not the same person you were when you started struggling. You're stronger now. Jake looked down at their joined hands, and Emma saw the exact moment he made his decision. It wasn't hope that crossed his face, but something more solid. Determination. Okay, he said simply. Let's do it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Emma threw herself into the project with the focused intensity she'd once reserved for breaking news stories, coordinating between investors, agricultural specialists, and contractors, with the skill of someone who'd finally found work that mattered. Jake, meanwhile, began the process of learning to ranch with declining vision. They installed audio warning systems around dangerous areas, painted high-contrast markers on gates and equipment, and established new routines that relied more on systematic approaches than visual assessment. The hardest part, Emma discovered, wasn't the practical adaptations. It was watching Jake wrestle with his pride, his fear of appearing weak or incompetent in front of the ranch hands who'd worked for his family for years. More than once, she found him in the barn after particularly difficult days, sitting alone in the dark, because the darkness was easier when it was his choice. It was during one of these moments that Miguel Santos, the ranch's longtime foreman, finally spoke up. You know, Jake, Miguel said one evening as they finished the feeding routine, my grandfather was blind for the last 20 years of his life. Diabetes took his sight when he was 45. Jake looked up from the notes he had been making about each animal's condition, relying now on audio recordings rather than visual observation. I didn't know that. He was the best horseman in 3 counties even after he lost his sight. Said horses don't care if you can see them, they care if you understand them. Same with cattle, I think. Miguel leaned against the fence, his weathered face thoughtful. Point is, you're still the same rancher you always were. You just have to learn new ways of doing things. What if I can't? What if I'm not strong enough to adapt? Miguel's laugh was gentle but firm. Jake, you've been adapting your whole life. When your mother died, you adapted. When your father got sick, you adapted. When the market crashed and we lost half our contracts, you adapted. This is just one more thing. Emma watched this exchange from the barn doorway, her heart full of gratitude for Miguel's quiet wisdom. She was learning that love wasn't just about the big gestures and dramatic declarations. Sometimes it was about Miguel staying late to help Jake learn new systems without making it feel like charity. Sometimes it was about Dr. Martinez calling with gentle reminders about cattle care rather than waiting for Jake to ask questions and he was too proud to voice. Sometimes it was about her own small contributions, reorganizing the office so Jake could find things by touch, researching audio technology, learning ranch work herself so she could be his eyes when needed. The night before their first investor meeting, Emma found Jake sitting on the front porch, staring out at the pastures he could barely see anymore in the darkness. Second thoughts, she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Every minute, he admitted. Emma, what if we're wrong? What if this whole plan is just wishful thinking, dressed up with fancy spreadsheets? Emma was quiet for a moment, considering his fear. Do you remember the night we saved those calves? You told me that sometimes you do everything right and still lose them. Yeah, but you also said that was ranching, taking care of what you can control and accepting what you can't. Emma reached for his hand in the darkness. We can't control whether the investors say yes. We can't control how quickly your vision deteriorates. We can't control market forces or weather or any of the 100 things that could go wrong. So why take the risk? Because the alternative is giving up without trying. Because some things are worth fighting for even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. Emma squeezed his hand. Because I'd rather fail trying to save something I love than succeed at walking away from it. Jake was quiet for a long time, but Emma felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. When did you get so wise? I learned from a very stubborn rancher who taught me that love means staying, especially when things get difficult. The investor meeting took place on a crisp October morning that painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and amber. Emma had spent the previous day making sure every detail was perfect. Clean facilities, organized paperwork, and a presentation that balanced emotional appeal with hard financial data. The investors, Dr. Sarah Kim from the Sustainable Agriculture Institute and Marcus Thompson from Green Future Investments, arrived in a pristine SUV that looked out of place among the ranch trucks and farm equipment. Emma felt Jake tense beside her as they approached, and she knew he was wondering if these city people would see past his limitations to the potential of what they were building. Mr. Morrison, Ms. Chen. Dr. Kim greeted them with a firm handshake and a smile that seemed genuine. Thank you for inviting us. We're excited to see what you've built here. Emma had planned the tour carefully, starting with the areas where their improvements were most visible. The new solar panel installation that would eventually power the entire operation. The demonstration plots where they'd been testing sustainable farming techniques. The renovated barn that would serve as a classroom and meeting space for workshops and educational programs. As they walked, Emma narrated the business plan, while Jake answered technical questions about cattle management and land use. She noticed that the investors seemed genuinely interested in Jake's expertise, asking follow-up questions about traditional ranching techniques and his thoughts on sustainable practices. It wasn't until they reached the section of pasture where the calves Emma had helped save were grazing that Marcus Thompson asked the question they'd been dreading. Mr. Morrison, we understand you have some health challenges that affect your vision. How do you see that impacting your ability to manage this operation? Emma felt Jake go very still beside her, and she held her breath, waiting for his response. You're right that my vision is deteriorating, Jake said, finally, his voice steady. But ranching isn't just about what you can see. It's about understanding animal behavior, land management, weather patterns, market forces. Those skills don't disappear because you can't see as well. He paused, gesturing toward the cattle. Take those calves over there. 3 weeks ago, they were dying from contaminated water. We saved them not because I could see the problem, but because I knew how to listen to what the cattle were telling me, how to work with a veterinarian, how to make quick decisions under pressure. None of that requires perfect vision. Kim nodded thoughtfully. And you have support systems in place. The best, Jake said, glancing at Emma. Miguel Santos has been my foreman for 15 years. He knows this operation as well as I do. Emma brings business and marketing expertise I've never had. And we're building relationships with agricultural extension programs that will provide ongoing consultation and support. What about the technology adaptations we discussed? Marcus asked. Emma pulled out her tablet, showing them the audio monitoring systems they'd installed, the smartphone apps that could read livestock information aloud, the tactile marking systems that helped Jake navigate equipment safely. We're not trying to work around Jake's vision loss, Emma explained. We're integrating it into a more systematic, technology-enhanced approach that could actually make the operation more efficient and data-driven than traditional methods. The investors spent another hour asking detailed questions about financial projections, marketing strategies, and expansion plans. Emma found herself falling into the rhythm of professional presentation, drawing on skills she'd developed during her journalism career, but applying them to something that mattered more than any story she'd ever written. As the meeting wound down, Dr. Kim and Marcus stepped aside to confer privately, while Jake and Emma waited by the truck, both trying to read their expressions for any hint of the decision. Whatever they decide, Jake said quietly, thank you for believing this was possible. It is possible, Emma replied firmly, no matter what they say today. Kim approached them with a smile that made Emma's heart leap. We'd like to move forward with a partnership. The Sustainable Agriculture Institute is prepared to offer a combination of grant funding and low-interest loans that would cover your startup costs, and Green Future Investments wants to discuss a long-term support agreement. Emma felt Jake's hand find hers, his grip tight with surprise and relief. You're serious. Completely serious. This is exactly the kind of innovative, sustainable operation we want to support. You're taking traditional ranching knowledge and adapting it for modern challenges while creating educational opportunities that benefit the broader community. Marcus shook both their hands. We'll have contracts drawn up within the week. After the investors left, Emma and Jake stood in their driveway watching the dust settle from their departure, both struggling to process what had just happened. We did it, Emma said finally. We actually did it. Jake turned to face her, and even though she knew his vision was limited, she felt completely seen in his gaze. No, Emma, you did it. This was your vision, your plan, your belief that we could make it work. Our vision, Emma corrected. Our plan, our future. The transformation of the Morrison Ranch didn't happen overnight, but by the following spring, it had become something neither Emma nor Jake had imagined possible. The cattle operation continued under Miguel's expanded leadership, but it was now supplemented by diverse agricultural projects that attracted visitors from across the region. The sustainable farming workshops drew participants from agricultural colleges and established ranchers looking to modernize their practices. The artist residency program brought writers, painters, and photographers who documented rural life while contributing to the local economy. Emma had found her calling as the director of communications and community outreach, writing grant applications and marketing materials with the same passion she'd once reserved for investigative journalism. Her work was featured in agricultural publications and sustainability magazines, and she'd even been invited to speak at conferences about innovative rural business models. Jake, meanwhile, had become something of a local celebrity. His story of adapting to vision loss while expanding his ranch operations had been picked up by national media, and he received regular visits from other visually impaired farmers seeking advice and encouragement. But the most profound changes were the personal ones. Grandma May had moved into the ranch house during the winter when her condition deteriorated to the point where she needed constant supervision. Emma had been terrified about how to manage her grandmother's care while maintaining their work at the ranch, but Jake had insisted on converting his father's old study into a comfortable bedroom and sitting area where Grandma May could be close to the daily activities without being overwhelmed. The arrangement had worked better than anyone expected. On her good days, Grandma May helped in the kitchen and shared stories with the workshop participants about traditional Chinese farming techniques her own family had used. On her difficult days, she sat quietly in her chair by the window, watching the life of the ranch unfold around her with the peaceful expression of someone who'd found her place in the world. It was on one of these quiet afternoons in early May that Jake found Emma sitting beside her grandmother's chair, both women dozing in the warm spring sunlight. "How is she today?" he asked softly. "Peaceful," Emma replied without opening her eyes. "She's been telling me stories about Robert all morning, memories I've never heard before." Jake settled into a nearby chair, his movements now confident and practiced in the familiar space. "Good memories. Beautiful ones. She said she's ready." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Dr. Williams had been preparing them for months, that Grandma May's decline was accelerating, that they were moving into the final stages of her illness. "Are you ready?" Jake asked gently. Emma opened her eyes to look at him, this man who'd become her partner in every sense of the word. Meh. "No, but I'm not alone anymore. That makes all the difference." Grandma May stirred in her chair, her eyes opening with the clarity that sometimes emerged from the confusion of her illness. "Emma dear," she said in Mandarin, then switched to English for Jake's benefit. "I've been having the most wonderful dream about your wedding." Emma felt her cheeks warm. She and Jake had talked about marriage in abstract terms, but with everything else happening in their lives, it had remained a someday conversation rather than an immediate plan. "What kind of dream, Nai?" "You were wearing my white dress, the one we found under the oak tree, and Jake wore his grandfather's suit, the one Robert was buried in." Grandma May's smile was serene. "It was here in the pasture where we scattered Robert's ashes last fall. So beautiful with all the wildflowers in bloom." Emma looked at Jake, seeing her own surprise reflected in his expression. They'd never discussed specifics about a wedding, but her grandmother's vision felt both impossible and perfect. "That sounds lovely, Grandma May," Emma said carefully. "It was more than lovely, dear. It was right." Grandma May reached for Emma's hand with fingers that felt increasingly fragile. Promise me you won't wait too long. Life is shorter than we think, and love is rarer than we hope. Unte Grandma May passed peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning when the ranch was alive with the sounds of spring, cattle lowing in the pastures, birds singing in the oak trees, and the distant hum of tractor engines as Miguel and his crew prepared for planting season. Emma found her when she went to bring morning tea, looking smaller than ever in the bed, but with an expression of such peace that Emma's first emotion was gratitude rather than grief. Her grandmother had lived fully and loved completely, and she'd spent her final months surrounded by the kind of family she'd chosen for herself rather than the one genetics had assigned. The funeral was exactly what Grandma May would have wanted, a mixture of Chinese traditions and Montana practicality held in the community center, with food provided by every family in Cedar Falls. Emma spoke about her grandmother's strength and wisdom, while Jake shared stories about the woman who'd helped him understand that love could survive anything if you were willing to adapt and grow. It wasn't until after the service, when Emma was cleaning out her grandmother's room, that she found the letter. It was in her grandmother's jewelry box, sealed in an envelope, with Emma's name written in careful English script. Inside, Emma found a single page covered in her grandmother's handwriting, partly in English and partly in Mandarin. My dearest Emma, if you are reading this, then I have gone on to whatever comes next, and you are beginning the next chapter of your story. I hope it is filled with as much love and joy as you have brought to my life. I want you to know that every choice I made, leaving Robert, marrying your grandfather, raising your mother alone when he died, taking you in when your father left, every single choice was made easier by the knowledge that it led to you. You are the best thing that came from all my decisions, good and bad. Take the dress, wear it when you marry Jake, which I hope will be soon. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Perfect moments are a luxury we cannot afford. Love him with all your heart, but don't lose yourself in loving him. Be partners, not just lovers. Build something together that neither of you could create alone. The ranch is yours now in every way that matters. Not because of money or legal documents, but because you chose to stay and fight for it. That makes it yours by right of love, which is the strongest claim of all. Be happy, my darling girl. Be brave. Be yourself always. All my love. 9 P.S. I hid Robert's ring in the flower canister. Jake will know what to do with it. Emma sat on her grandmother's bed, crying and laughing at the same time as she read the letter again. Even in death, Grandma May was still orchestrating their lives with the gentle manipulation of someone who'd learned that love sometimes required a helping hand. She found Jake in the barn, working with one of the new ranch hands on equipment maintenance. When she showed him the letter, he read it twice before looking up at her with an expression that was equal parts amusement and awe. She really was something, wasn't she? She was everything, Emma agreed. Jake, about what she wrote? Emma Chen. Jake interrupted, getting down on one knee right there in the barn, surrounded by hay bales and the smell of cattle and the ordinary magic of their daily life. Will you marry me? Emma started laughing through her tears. You don't even have a ring. I will in about 5 minutes if your grandmother's hiding places are as good as her matchmaking skills. Jake's smile was radiant despite the uncertainty in his voice. Is that a yes? That's the biggest yes in the history of yes, Emma said, pulling him to his feet so she could kiss him properly. They were married 6 weeks later in the pasture, where they'd scattered Robert Morrison's ashes surrounded by wildflowers and the people who'd become their chosen family. Emma wore her grandmother's white dress, altered to fit, but still carrying the dreams of a love that had endured across decades. Jake wore his grandfather's suit, found preserved in a cedar chest in the ranch house attic. Miguel walked Emma down the makeshift aisle while Dr. Martinez, who'd become their friend as well as their veterinarian, officiated the ceremony. The guest list included ranch hands and investors, longtime neighbors, and new friends from the agricultural community, all gathered to celebrate a love story that had taken 26 years and multiple generations to reach its happy ending. But the most meaningful moment came when Emma and Jake exchanged rings, her grandmother's simple band and a new one Jake had made himself from gold found on Morrison land, both symbols of their commitment to honoring the past while building something entirely their own. As they kissed for the first time as husband and wife, Emma thought about all the paths that had led them to this moment. The scholarship she'd lost that had seemed like the end of the world. The years of anger and separation that had felt like punishment. the return home that had looked like defeat but turned into discovery. Every choice, every mistake, every moment of pain had been part of a larger story that was still being written. And now, standing in a pasture in Montana with her husband's arms around her and their future stretching ahead like open prairie, Emma finally understood what her grandmother had known all along. Love wasn't about finding the perfect person or the perfect moment. It was about choosing to tend the garden of your heart with someone who was willing to dig in the dirt beside you to plant new seeds when the old ones failed, to weather storms and celebrate harvests and trust that growth was possible even in the hardest soil. As the reception continued around them, toasts and laughter and the kind of celebration that turns a house into a home, Emma and Jake slipped away to the oak tree where their grandparents' story had been buried and their own had been reborn. No regrets, Jake asked, his arm around her waist, as they looked out over the ranch that was now officially theirs. None, Emma said, and meant it completely. You. Only that it took us so long to figure it out. Emma smiled, thinking about time and timing and all the ways love found you when you were finally ready to receive it. I think we figured it out exactly when we were supposed to. Above them, the oak tree rustled in the evening breeze, its leaves whispering secrets about love and loss and the beautiful, complicated ways that families are made. And in the distance, the ranch continued its eternal rhythms, cattle settling for the night equipment, standing ready for tomorrow's work, and the endless Montana sky, watching over it all with the patience of something that had seen 1,000 love stories and knew that the best ones were always worth the wait. 1 year later, Emma Morrison stood in the doorway of what had once been Grandma May's room, now converted into a nursery painted in soft yellows and greens. Her hand rested on her rounded belly, where their daughter moved restlessly, as though she too was eager to meet the world that awaited her. Outside, she could hear Jake's voice as he worked with the summer workshop participants, teaching them about sustainable cattle management with the confidence of someone who'd learned that expertise had nothing to do with perfect vision. The ranch had grown beyond their wildest projections, featured in national magazines, and hosting visitors from around the world who came to learn about their innovative approaches to agriculture and accessibility. But the success of their business venture wasn't what made Emma smile as she arranged the last of the baby clothes in the antique dresser that had belonged to 5 generations of Morrison women. It was the sound of Jake's laughter carried on the summer breeze, the knowledge that their daughter would grow up surrounded by love and land and the kind of community that chose to show up for each other in both celebrations and sorrows. The baby kicked, and Emma pressed her hand to the spot, feeling the strength that was already evident in their daughter's movements. "Your daddy's teaching people about cows again," she murmured. "And your great-grandmama's garden is blooming beautifully this year. You're going to love it here, little one. There's so much to show you." Through the window, Emma watched Jake gesture toward the pasture where their cattle grazed peacefully, his movements confident and sure, despite the white cane that had become his constant companion. Their students, Alberto, a mix of agricultural college graduates and experienced ranchers, hung on his every word, notebooks out and phones recording as he shared knowledge that had taken generations to accumulate. This was the life they'd built together, not the one either of them had imagined at 18, but something richer and more meaningful than their younger selves could have conceived. A life rooted in the soil of their shared history, but growing toward a future that held infinite possibility. Emma's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez. "Your latest article in Sustainable Farming Quarterly is fantastic. The photos of Jake working with the students are perfect. You two are changing minds about what's possible." She smiled, thinking about the article she'd written about accessible ranching techniques and the accompanying photo series that showed Jake at work. The piece had been picked up by agricultural publications across the country, generating inquiries from other farmers dealing with disabilities and invitations to speak at conferences about adaptive technology in agriculture. But more importantly, it had opened conversations about the different ways people could contribute to their communities, about the value of experience and wisdom that went beyond physical capability. The baby kicked again, and Emma laughed softly. Okay, I get it. You want to go outside and see what all the excitement is about." She made her way to the front porch where Miguel was setting up chairs for the evening's community dinner, a tradition they'd started during their first summer of workshops, and that had grown into a weekly gathering for anyone who wanted to share food and stories. "How's our little rancher doing today?" Miguel asked, nodding toward Emma's belly. Active. I think she's going to be as stubborn as her father. God help us all, Miguel said with a grin. One Morrison with strong opinions is challenging enough. Two might be more than the ranch can handle. Emma laughed, settling into her favorite porch chair to watch Jake finish his demonstration. In a few hours, the workshop participants would join them for dinner, along with neighbors and friends and the extended family they'd created through shared work and mutual support. The table would be filled with stories and laughter, and their daughter would fall asleep to the sounds of community and belonging. It wasn't the life Emma had planned, but it was the life she'd chosen. And as she watched her husband share his knowledge with eager students, as she felt their daughter moving restlessly beneath her heart, as she looked out over the land that had become truly theirs through love and commitment and the simple decision to stay, Emma knew with absolute certainty that some of the best things in life were the ones you never saw coming. The evening breeze carried the scent of hay and wildflowers, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed contentedly in pastures that stretched toward mountains and sky and all the tomorrows that awaited them. Emma closed her eyes and smiled, thinking about gardens and growth and the beautiful, unpredictable ways that love could take root and flourish in even the most unlikely soil.